It is PyramKing. I'm really excited to be here today with another CoS Strahd interview. And the person I'm interviewing today, well, if you've spent any time on Reddit or any time with CoS Strahd, they really need no introductions. It's DragnaCarta. Thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm a fan. Of course, I'm a Patreon member as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's always an incredible pleasure, and I really appreciate the chance to chat with you about this stuff. CoS Strahd, you couldn't stop me from talking about it, so I always appreciate the soapbox.
Oh, it's not a problem. I mean, of course, when I got back into CoS Strahd from Ravenloft, I hadn't revisited it until 2020, and so it was really your guys that really kind of got me comfortable getting back into DMing this. So big inspiration for me. Before we get into the questions, because I got a lot of these questions, I want to know how you got involved in D&D and specifically CoS Strahd.
Yeah, sure. So D&D wise, I got involved in D&D and RPGs in general way back in I think around 2008 or so with 4th edition. I got as a Christmas gift, I think it was the red box, you know, the one with the dragon on the cover, and I had no idea what I was doing, right? I thought it was a board game because my parents knew that I liked fantasy, you know, I liked games, so it's like, oh, here's a board game. But I was really confused when I opened it. I was like, where's the board? Where are the pieces? And I was just completely bewildered. And eventually, though, I understood what D&D was about, how it worked, and from there, I started playing 4E. I branched out a little bit in around that time into the Dresden Files RPG. I dabbled a little bit in Pathfinder, but not for too long. Played some online communities as well. I remember there was a big forum. It was kind of built this multi-world forum where everyone played all the games connected to each other, kind of a West Marches situation, but writ large. And as time went on, you know, I kind of played on and off for a few years. And then when 5e came out, I got back into it, especially around 2015 or so, 2016 in a big way. CoS Strahd was coming out around then. It was the first full 5th edition campaign that I wound up running, and I just absolutely fell in love. The narrative depth of it, the characters, the richness of the setting and the tone were things that all just really drew me to it. And what I wound up doing eventually was sometime around 2017-ish, I think, I got involved on the CoS Strahd subreddit. I posted a very kind of basic bare bones guide called Lessons from Running CoS Strahd. I'd seen someone else, I think it was a user called Pain Traina, post a series called What I've Learned from Running CoS Strahd twice. And I kind of wanted to throw my 2 cents in, you know, kind of ape what I'd seen other people doing, sharing their experiences. And that wound up actually becoming the basis of my guide to running the module CoS Strahd Reloaded, which I basically continued writing for the next 4.5 years or so, more quickly at first and kind of tapering off with over time. But then, you know, COVID happened, pandemic happened. I got back into CoS Strahd in a really big way. Me and a bunch of other DMs from the CoS Strahd subreddit started running Twice Bitten, a entirely rules as written, live streamed podcast, actual play about the module that had really great reception, and it really got me back into the module and thinking about it in a really deeper way. And so that's what kind of spurred me, kind of really getting in depth and trying to understand and grok the gears that made this adventure tick, that so many people love, that is literally 5e's most popular adventure. And that wound up inspiring me to revisit Reloaded a little bit late last year. And so since then, I've been back on the Reloaded train, even after ostensibly finishing the first iteration. I've been giving it a wholesale makeover ever since.
So let me ask you about that, because I'm really familiar with Reloaded. Obviously, I read through it as hundreds, if not thousands, of other people. What is the big update? What would you say is the big update to the new Reloaded? What are some special things in there that you want to key on?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the first Reloaded, you know, the gist of it was that there were a lot of objections, there were a lot of problems that people had with running the module. People found fights auto TPKs. People were confused by dungeons. They didn't really understand how to play Strahd. There were a lot of disparate elements of the module, from the Druids of Yester Hill to the whole dinner with Fiona situation, that were really underbaked. And I think for me, one of the things that really differentiated my approach from someone like Mandy Mod at the time, who was doing her Fleshing Out series of CoS Strahd, was that my priority, I really wanted to focus on seeing what was already there and tying those pieces together, right? For me, CoS Strahd has always been about kind of deepening it and tying those parts together and filling in the gaps, as opposed to building out even further. which, both of them are very valid paths of taking of, kind of exploring adventures. I think they're both very worth looking into. But for me, Reloaded was all about tying the pieces together, filling in the gaps, and answering those questions to really make it a playable, understandable, accessible experience, right? And above all else, a satisfying one, because something that came through, if you've read the original module, of course, is that it ends with Strahd. You can't kill him permanently. He keeps coming back. You have a lot of situations where the players have bad choices or no good ones, or there are trap options like the Dark Gifts with the Amber Vestiges and the Amber Temple. And a lot of Reloaded was aimed toward, making the game satisfying, updating it to make it feel more fair for a modern generation of players, where a lot of those sorts of gotchas or loose ends might have felt more satisfying and more reasonable to, say, a classic AD&D or 3.5 audience, but would really ring true, I felt, to a lot of players and DMs who'd grown up with 5e's more narrative, kind of cohesive approach to the game. And so that was the original Reloaded. The revised Reloaded, as I've been working on it since last December, November or so, one of the things that I've been working on the side, in addition to Reloaded, has been the Patreon, which I started a little over 2 years ago at this point. And one of the things that I've had a lot of fun doing with that is, in trying to kind of branch out, give a bit of value to my patrons. I've done a lot of workshops on basic DMing skills. I published a lot of reference materials, a lot of tools, and part of the benefit of this has been, they say that the best way to learn something is to teach it, and part of the fun of doing the Patreon is that it's really forced me to understand and analyze and get really good at the fundamentals of narrative and gameplay design, especially in the context of TTRPGs and D&D specifically. Concepts like, what is a dramatic question, where it's a concept from screenwriting where it's all about, what is the tension of this scene and why are the players invested in what's going to happen next? Or concepts like challenges, what is the actual gameplay loop of the module, a gameplay loop of a combat encounter or a social encounter? What does it mean to run a puzzle or a skill challenge, and to really get into the nitty-gritty of what those concepts are and how they operate in the space of narrative and game design. Those were some of the really deeper things that I've been able to kind of reflect on and hone and develop over the course of the Patreon. In general, this idea of really deliberate, intentional DMing, where at the base for a new DM, it's all very overwhelming and you're doing your best to keep up. And then from there, at a level beyond that, you're trying to figure out, what are the coolest ideas? How can I express myself? Really use DMing as a sort of artistic exploration to really create the shared world with my players. But I think beyond that, something I've been very fortunate to be able to focus on with the Patreon, and now that I've been trying to implement with the new Reloaded, is this idea of very deliberate narrative and game design, where every choice you make, every shred of content you add, has to justify its presence, has to earn its keep. There's a saying in writing called "kill your darlings," and I think with the new Reloaded, something I've actually had to do a lot of is kill a lot of ideas, a lot of fun things that either the community loves or that I loves, because ultimately they're either not serving the story, that is, they're undermining the themes, or they are clashing with the themes, or they're not earning their keep by really resonating with the players, or because they're not serving the gameplay, because they're not fun, they're not fair, they're not enjoyable, they're not serving it, or perhaps both.
Oh,
One example is
I definitely get that for sure.
Yeah, so a lot of the new Reloaded was about, where the original Reloaded was me kind of blindly feeling my way through the module and just kind of going by gut, by community feedback, thinking, oh, this is a thing that's not right, let me try to flesh it out a little bit, tie it together, fill in the gaps. The new Reloaded has been all about viewing it holistically as this cohesive experience. What sort of adventure am I trying to create? What sort of impact am I trying to have on the players? What do I want their takeaways to be? What are the themes that I want to resonate? And what is the dramatic experience I want them to have curated through every single beat of every scene of every chapter? And the tricky part while doing that is you don't want to be too overbearing. You don't want to limit the kinds of stories that players can tell. You don't want to make it unfun or to railroad them to a particular outcome. And instead, a lot of it is about learning to use soft touches to kind of manipulate and curate the experience so that the players can tell the stories that they love. And so I could go on for hours about, how specifically I've tried to do that in the new Reloaded, but I think that's really been my lodestar, my guiding light has been, how do I curate and craft this experience with a very deliberate, artistic designer's intent, as opposed to just kind of choosing ideas that seem cool, choose and shape and sculpt content that delivers the best experience taken together that I can possibly shape.
Well, I could tell you that from my experience, your first Reloaded was very influential when I got back to CoS Strahd and ran it for the first time as a DM. I actually played Ravenloft in 83, 84 as just a player. My thing was a 2 hit point thief didn't make it. I had to roll up a new character. And I was really impressed when I got back into 5e, which I had taken a hiatus from D&D, and then COVID happened. So when I got back into it, I was kind of blown away on this small Ravenloft module, which i6 module at the time, which was fairly big and my favorite, to seeing how much more was fleshed out. So I was really, really excited about it. But I felt when I was reading it, it was a very, very disjointed book, very frustrating for me. And your first Reloaded guide really helped me work through the book because it's a very disorganized book in my personal opinion.
Yeah.
And that leads me to my first Curse of Strahd question. And I have a lot of them here. So I hope I know you're busy, but I hope we have enough time to get through all of them. But here's the first one. And you probably see this a lot on Reddit. Hey, I'm going to DM Curse of Strahd for the first time. I just got the book. What's the first thing you recommend me to do?
Sure. So the first thing, and I think most DMs who have run or are running Curse of Strahd will tell you first, is read the book, just cover to cover. And I would say this for any adventure. Now, the way that I'm approaching the new Reloaded is it's intentionally modular, such that you can just read one chapter at a time and just completely ignore everything until you need it. But because, as you said, the way that Wizards of the Coast writes their modules, you can't really gain a top-down understanding or appreciation of the themes, the characters, the storyline, or even the gameplay until you've read through the entire thing. And I imagine from what I've heard, that's partially intentional on their part. They draft them more like these kind of narrative forms rather than technical documents because they want people to buy the books even if they're never going to read the adventure, which makes lives a little more difficult for those of us who actually want to get in the DM's chair for this adventure. But first off, always read it in full if you can. From there, obviously there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of content online. There's a lot of guides, a lot of advice, a lot of tips and feedback. And I think the important thing is to be very judicious and very intentional about how and where you choose to implement it. And I could talk a little bit more about this later with regard to, introducing third-party content. But in general, one of the biggest questions that people always ask me, especially on my Patreon where I offer campaign advice, folks will, kind of ping me at, 11 p.m. and say, hey, Dragna, this was going on my campaign. What the heck do I do? And very often the question is, what would Strahd do here? And because their players have done something strange or confusing or dangerous, and they want to know how Strahd would react, because he's a very ever-present villain. And Barovia itself is like that. It's this kind of living, breathing entity where all of the pieces are connected. And the way that I respond to these questions is I don't answer them. Instead, I always ask in turn, who is your Strahd? First off, who is your villain, and what would he do here? And then very often they don't know the answer to that. And so then I ask a corollary, which is, what effect do you want to have Strahd have on your players? Because this is coming back to this idea of deliberate game design, right? Where do we want Strahd to make the players feel hopeless? Do we want him to make the players feel like they are, in a very tight spot, but that ultimately they can overcome him? Is this a Castlevania situation? Is this an Amnesia situation? And so by taking the time to stop, breathe, ask yourself, what kind of experience am I trying to create for my players? And then reverse engineer everything from there. It's another step of work to do, but I've felt in my experience it actually makes your job a lot easier, because suddenly it's a lot harder to feel overwhelmed because now you're making all these decisions with very specific intent, and you can kind of shape everything toward that ultimate goal of giving your players an enjoyable experience. So read the book, think about the experience you want to deliver, read other people's experiences, other people's advice to give yourself a sense of what's going on and what to look out for and what to be wary of, but be choosy, be deliberate, and don't just rush into things because someone on Reddit told you to.
Right. That's really really good advice. I offer the same advice as well. One of the things I like to touch on, and I guess it's through my own writing experience, is, and I find this happens probably in Curse of Strahd, is a lot of people, probably more novice DMs, approach it as Strahd's just this bad guy, so he does bad things because he's a bad guy, and they forget that people do things with intent. People have an agenda. And as you mentioned before, once you have determined what Strahd's agenda is in your particular campaign, then all of his decision making is going to be following that particular agenda, right? So until the characters actually cross paths with whatever Strahd's particular agenda is that you decide to run that campaign, they're just a nuisance. He doesn't really care about them, right? It's not until he can use them to manipulate them into his own agenda, or they hinder whatever he's trying to do. And that leads me to the.
I do think I actually want to kind of emphasize that, and kind of, if you don't mind, building that a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, because I think that it's very, very true that you want to be consistent with your NPCs. You want to understand them before you act with them. But I think there's another level beyond that, and there's something that I'm kind of fond of saying to my Patreon members whenever they're talking about an NPC doing something, is that we talk a lot about Strahd as though he's, this actual figure, like he has his own wants and desires and needs and preferences. But I think it's important to remember he's not real. And that sounds a little glib to say, so let me explain. Strahd is a construct in our game who exists only so that we may make our players feel in certain ways. To make them feel satisfied or tense or afraid or angry. He is a puppet dancing on our strings. He does nothing that we don't want him to do, and for no purpose than what we want him to serve. And so I think it's very important to always take that step back and to remember that Strahd von Zarovich isn't real. There's no right way or wrong way to run him in accordance with his own wants or desires. We need to remember that ultimately he's a tool. He's a wrench in the toolbox of game design, and we're going to tweak his screws and nail him together in the exact right way to make the effect we want to create. And while we want our players to believe in him, the DM should never forget that, as per a particular saying in screenwriting, anything that the players don't see on the screen isn't real. Until the players see it happening, it doesn't exist. And so you should always feel free to workshop that, to change it, to modify the heck out of it. Because ultimately, Strahd should be serving your goals, not the other way around.
Well, that leads me to the next question. How do you recommend introducing third-party content? And I know when I mean third-party content, I mean, obviously there's Reloaded, Mandy Mod's Guide, Lunch Break Heroes, Legends of Barovia, my guides. But there's also, and I see this question pop up a lot, is people are looking for alternative monsters or stat blocks from third-party content. So how do you recommend introducing third-party content?
Sure, so we'll start with the guides. And I think, as you can probably attest to this, and if we asked, Lunchbreak or Mandy, they'd probably agree, when we're working on these guides, they're generally speaking a very cohesive, very, intentional, kind of vision for how the adventure is going to be run. And so I see a lot of folks who kind of say, I'll take a little bit from Mandy, a little bit from Dragna, a little bit from Pyram, and a little bit from Lunchbreak. And I would kind of caution people against that, not because I'm trying to, shoot out the competition, but because there's a lot of thought and care that I'm sure goes into your guides that Lunchbreak and Mandy do as well. And the thirst for content can be very blinding when the goal should not be I want cool ideas so much as I want content that's going to ring true, that's going to work together, that's going to serve my goal for the campaign. And so you always run a risk, and I want to be caution people here, which kind of sounds ironic given that I'm a guy who writes a guide, is when you're reading a guide, try to get an understanding of why it's doing what it's doing. I try to include design notes in all of the chapters that I publish for Reloaded so that people can understand the choices that I'm making and what effect I'm trying to have them have on the campaign. And so really try to be deliberate. Again, that's a touchstone to keep coming back to, rather than just taking pieces like you're at a buffet or a salad bar. Sometimes that might involve, you going with one guide particularly because it rings true to the vision of what you want the campaign to be and you really understand the author's reasoning. Sometimes that might result in you not using any guide at all because that vision does not ring true to you and your players. And sometimes you might have good reason to, mix and match a little bit, but when you do, it's always worth it to take a step back and think, I'm mixing here, marinara sauce and mustard. They might taste really good as toppings or sauces independently, but do I really want to put them over the same, plate of whatever I'm cooking? And it's a question that people want to ask.
That's good advice, and just to dangle it out there, my work or Legends of Barovia is really inspired by classic literature from Shakespeare through, and I put in my appendix N, Gothic horror. I use a lot of references to old Gothic novels, as well as 18th century literature, as well as Shakespeare. So it's more of a little bit different theme, which I use the Fey quest as a common plot thread through it. So no, that's good advice. I mean, I definitely spent a lot of time in my particular guides threading it all together to meet a particular feeling and storyline. But there's a lot of people, by the way, that you do use Legends of Barovia, but do lift scenes or parts from both Mandy Mod and yourself, as well as Lunch Break Heroes of Well. But it's probably, it's great advice. Read through it, see if it's kind of a theme that you want to run, and recognize the fact that, DragnaCarta, Lunch Break Heroes, myself, have created a common theme, because this is an epic campaign with a lot of strings attached. So that leads me to my next question. And this is an interesting question, because I get this a lot. You probably do as well. Do you recommend any particular homebrew rules or any Dungeon Master variant rules specifically because Curse of Strahd's unique, being a Gothic horror, so it's a little challenging in 5e as a high fantasy game. So is there any rules, homebrew or DM variants that you recommend?
So I guess kind of as a gateway question to that, Curse of Strahd aesthetically is very much a Gothic horror campaign, but the way that I tend to approach it and the way that Reloaded tries to approach it, and of course I'm sure this is different for other folks, is that I very much view it as a dark fantasy campaign in the style of The Witcher, for example. And so for me, when I'm running Curse of Strahd, I'm tending to run it or preparing it for audiences who are, again, those kind of very modern 5e players, kind of critical role inspired, maybe not in terms of depth of roleplay, but certainly the sense of expecting to be heroes rather than dungeon delvers. And so when I'm sitting at the table, when I'm in the author's chair, a lot of what I'm considering is how do I bring forward that heroic thread? Obviously you don't want to always have knights in shining armor, but I've tried to structure Reloaded to give that sort of heroic experience in a way that's still satisfying and I hope rings true to the Gothic horror aesthetics and underpinnings. Beyond that, in terms of rules themselves, I've experimented a little bit. In Twice Bitten, we tried lingering injuries. They were flavorful, but they ultimately fell short for us. They just kind of felt more like an inconvenience at one point than anything else. I'm personally not a fan of madness or sanity rules or fear rules. I respect people who find them inclusive, but for me, I view D&D primarily as, I like to call it a physics engine, where because I cannot arbitrarily say your player, floats up or falls down to the ground, I have the game handle those rules, for falling damage or fireball or whatnot for me. But when it comes to, actual roleplay of characters, I prefer to really entrust, the players, the DM to decide how would your player react here. I really philosophically disagree with the concept of kind of imposing that via mechanics upon a player. And maybe I wouldn't enjoy Call of Cthulhu if I played it, I don't know. But that's my personal philosophy, so I tend to avoid those. I guess insofar as just kind of homebrew or in general, I tend to be a very rules as written kind of DM. I tend to favor, as you've probably guessed, a kind of elegance and simplicity at this point. For me, 5e is a medium through which the game is told. It is not itself the game. And so I like to, try to keep to the main guidebook as much as I can, with a few exceptions. First, obviously, like I think 90% of people, I let bonuses be drank as a bonus action. Secondly, I nerf the hell out of Twilight Cleric and Moon Druid. I have a remix of Twilight Cleric that makes it a lot more balanced. And for the Moon Druid at my table, we're currently playtesting. You get CR 1/2 at when you first get the subclass, and we're actually considering reducing it to CR 1/4. And then the other homebrew that I use is just, less about gameplay and more structural, where when I'm running combat to keep things moving quickly. What I do is, or what I'm about to experiment with doing, I've been doing a lot of experimenting with kind of reorganizing combat, having players go on different teams at the same time, acting concurrently. And one thing I'm going to try out at my next session, actually, because I am an incorrigible experimenter, is, rather than teams run rules as written combat, but at the start of combat, every round there is what I'm calling a planning round, where the players get as much time as they need to check their abilities, discuss tactics, discuss strategy, ask questions of the DM, and then as soon as they lock in their planning round, you have to know exactly what you're doing, exactly when your turn starts, and if you don't, you forfeit it until later in the round. And so the idea being that it encourages tactics and strategy, and at the same time, if things get overwhelming or if the battlefield changes, once per combat, someone can call for bullet time, and they get a second planning round right in the middle of combat, right then and there. And so I'm going to look to try that out, but I think that really speaks to kind of my general philosophy with Homebrew, is that for me, the base game is generally sufficient for my needs. I might tweak it or fine tune it sometimes if I find that things are overpowered or underpowered. But for me, the opportunity for innovation really comes more in about how the game is played around the table, and I find a lot of joy in exploring those sorts of ideas.
That actually leads me into this next question here is, how do you handle character death and resurrection? I would assume your rules is written with the death saves, and using the rules as written resurrection, or is there anything you adjust to that, or do you back off a little bit with your hit points or your damage if you think the character's going to die? How do you manage character death, because it is a deadly campaign, or can be?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So actually, this is actually a perfect segue. One of my big projects, in addition to Reloaded, over the past year and a half, has been something that I've been calling Challenge Ratings 2.0. It started last January or February on my Substack, where I started kind of trying to do a deep dive into, how D&D combat math worked, and questions of the action economy. Because you're right, a lot of the time I got really irritated at people, because philosophically for me, and again, people can run how they want in their own games, but philosophically, I just couldn't get behind the idea of, I'm so scared of players dying that I'm going to fudge the numbers. I'm going to fudge the dice, and I won't let them do it. And mea culpa, I've been guilty of this a few times. So, I certainly live in a glass house, and I probably shouldn't throw stones. But that was a big concern for me, especially running a campaign as deadly as Curse of Strahd. Because ultimately, again, the way the audience that I tend to design for and the audience I tend to run for, their players are, their characters are their joy, right? We're not, a lot of the time, especially at my tables, we're not dealing with, very classic AD&D players, who, they're happy to go through the Tomb of Horrors with 5 spare character sheets, and they get it back up whenever they need to. A lot of the players that, I have in mind when I'm running or when I'm writing are players who really fall in love with a particular character and their story. And under those circumstances, of course, you're killing off a character is something you can only really do with great gravity and great care, and you really want to make sure that it's earned and that you don't accidentally kill someone in a random encounter, for example. So through this series of blog posts on my Substack, I kind of went down this rabbit hole of madness, where I started kind of examining the underlying ways in which 5e combat math worked, and then I started kind of going into this absolute rabbit hole of madness over a course of around 8 weeks, through April through May of 2022. And when I came out the other end, I was horrified to discover that I had accidentally created a mathematical algorithm that basically explained why some sides lose and win in D&D 5th edition specifically. It was an actual encounter building system that you could use it to calibrate how many hit points an encounter was expected to consume from your players. And it was resilient and robust for parties of 4 players, 5, 6, 2, for 30 goblins or 3. And we actually playtested it substantially on the Patreon and elsewhere. And folks kept telling me, Dragna, this system that you've made, this encounter building system, the CR 2.0, I'm finding it's actually accurate. I'm no longer flinging darts at a dartboard. I actually have an appreciation for how I can get my players as tired as I want them by the end of the day, and to actually build encounters that meaningfully tax them. And so when I started writing Reloaded, Revised Reloaded, I was able to bring that system in and really calibrate all of the encounters and all of the adventuring days precisely as reasonably possible, because of course there is a bit of swinginess, as there always is within 5e, but to make sure that there was never more than a very small risk of TPK. We're talking, the battle with the Fleshmound and Death House, that is a 2-phase encounter where each phase is CR2 that is calibrated so that the players will not spend, or are very unlikely to spend, more than 40% of their hit points on the whole fight. Or maybe it was like 60%, I can't recall. But you put those pieces together and suddenly you can see these more beautiful tapestries take shape where, these are very much, more in the vein of a Witcher or Skyrim or kind of modern gaming experience where there's always a risk, there's always a tension, but because you've done your work behind the veil of designing the game, there's never a real threat to the players, however much they believe it otherwise. And for me, it rings a little more fair and a little more immersive than the way that, tends to work when you're fudging the dice. Because
so let me pry into that a little bit more. I'm familiar with your CR2 system as a Patreon. Would you say your core philosophy in designing this is to create a more balanced type encounters, so that you're matching that for people that aren't familiar with it, you're matching not only the party size and action economy, but also the levels against the monsters or creatures that you're facing?
Exactly. The overall goal is because, a lot of the time, on Reddit or wherever, you'll see people saying, oh, encounter making is an art, not a science. You just kind of got to feel for it. You got to fudge the numbers, just let it work. Just the monsters die when I say they die. And that is a philosophy. I don't hold to it myself. For me, it's all about creating encounters that let the party be heroes. And the definition of a hero is someone who struggles against adversity but ultimately overcomes, in this kind of context of the games that we play. And, 20, 30 years ago, you could run a game where, you slap down a beholder when the players are level 2, and, the players have to use all of their wits and all of their 10-foot poles to figure out a way to get around it. You can't do that anymore. A lot of players these days, and I say this with love, they favor a more narrative game, a more organic game, and they get very attached to their characters. So they wind up, kind of not wanting to put in this really deep mathematical crunch to figure out how to optimize their experience in terms of winning battles, but they also, they really don't want to lose their characters because they really mean a lot to them. And so CR 2.0 kind of really fits this vision as I'm making real challenges. It's not arbitrary. You have earned every one of your victories, but they've always been achievable goals, like a teacher setting up, trials that I know you'll be able to knock down. It's still giving a sense of accomplishment. It's still fair. It's still valid, but it's never more than I know you can handle. And that's really the experience that I'm trying to create, where these balance encounters, so to speak, they scale with the players and they really create this tense experience that is matched to the player's capacity and their skill set. And the nice thing is once you have these numbers and you have this algorithm in play, you can really adjust it upward or downward, where, if you have players who really are very, very savvy and very, very good at what they do and very strategic and tactical, you can actually calibrate it so that the difficulty is higher than would be necessary for a normal party, but still operates to make balanced encounters for this more tactical party. And so I think that's part of the joy of it for me, where it lets you be this kind of AI behind the screen of the game, where you're always calibrating, always matching it to your players, always creating things that are tough enough to make them sweat, but never tough enough to knock them down. And I think that makes for a really rewarding and enriching experience for the players, all things together.
What do you think about, and I've had this conversation with a few DMs, about intentionally non-balanced encounters in which the characters have to assess the risk and realize, there's no way we're going to win. The best solution is for us to retreat. And this person's argument, and I don't want to share who it was stating that they purposely don't balance all their encounters. They make ones in which he telegraphs to the players through the creature's interactions that you're probably not going to live if you make this engagement. And his theory behind it is if I always balance encounters, the characters will always fight because you've bred into them that every single encounter is really a speed bump or hurdle which you'll be able to win. And I understand the merits of that concept, which I know D&D is not built around that, or it's shifted away from that. What's your thought about non-balanced encounters?
Yeah, so I think that, kind of coming back to player types, and it really is incredibly important to know your players here. There's a quadrant that I've shared around the Patreon, and I forget if I posted a Substack on it, way back when I was still at a Substack. I like to kind of divide players into 4 quadrants, the political compass of D&D players, where the vertical axis is how tactical and crunchy of a player you are, and the horizontal axis is, how attached you are to your characters. And so, kind of on the top of it, you have, on the top left, you have players who are very, very tactical, very, very crunchy, and, aren't incredibly attached to their characters. Or I guess instead of attached to their characters, a better way to put it is how afraid you are of losing. That's the horizontal axis. So vertical is how crunchy you are. Horizontal is how much you dislike losing. And so on the top left, you've got what I like to call challengers, where they are totally fine with losing, but they're really, really tactical and crunchy. A friend of mine once told me, if an encounter does not pose at least some risk of a TPK, I'm going to be bored. Because for him, for challenger players, the game is like a puzzle. It's a brain teaser. It's always seeking, how can you optimize? How can you overcome? And for those kinds of players, unbalanced encounters are themselves part of the joy of the game. I myself am a bit of a challenger. I like creative problem solving and doing weird things to try to innovate and make them work and laughing it off when it doesn't go well. Top right quadrant, you've got your champions, I call them. They, are very, very crunchy, very, very tactical, but they really are. They don't play the game to lose; they play the game to win. Or that is, they really don't like failure. These are what you would call unkindly. I have a lot of good faith to all of these types of players. So please don't take this as though I'm belittling anyone. But these would be your munchkins, so to speak. Folks who are really fascinated by big crunchy character builds. They want to deal blowout damage, but they want to have someone to experience those victories.
Would you say
like Hercules?
Would you say the champions would be a good definition? Are those the min-maxers?
Yes, exactly. The champions are the min-maxers. And the problem with giving unbalanced encounters to them is that whether it's because they want to unwind after a long day or because it's just fun to them, they play D&D for the power fantasy. And so by giving them unbalanced encounters, you're taking away part of what makes the game so enjoyable to them. They want to be good at something, to do it well, and to see those results reflected in the gameplay. Bottom left quadrant, they are not very tactical, but they really don't mind losing. I call them the explorers. They're fine with, unbalanced encounters. They might unbalance encounters themselves intentionally by doing silly things if they think it's funny or it's interesting. They just want to tell an interesting story, and they're here for that, and I respect that. I had a player who always had 6 backup characters, wasn't very tactical, but he just wanted to have a good time, and he was a kind of an archetypal explorer. Bottom right is what I like to call the protagonist, and in today's D&D community, protagonists are easily 80% of all of the D&D players at the table. A protagonist is not very tactical, they're not very crunchy. Maybe they looked up a Treant Monk guide or something, but they're not really optimizing. They'd rather cast Fireball than Hypnotic Pattern, because Fireball is a really cool spell, and who can blame them? And at the same time, they're really attached to their characters. They really have this kind of deep sense of integrity and pride about this is a narrative where good triumphs over evil, where we're empowered to make our own choices, where we're agents of change at the table. And if you take that away from them, it really diminishes their ability to enjoy the game. And so for those right-hand side, those champions of the protagonists, first off, adding a non-combat encounter, or encounters that are unbalanced, I should say, sorry. Adding an unbalanced encounters really threatens to diminish what they like about the game. It can actually lure them into a lot of traps because they're coming into the game with a certain preconception of how the game is meant to be played. They're expecting it in a certain way. And if you are giving them unbalanced encounters, first off, that is going to violate their expectations and might lead to frustrations or tensions or conflict away from the table as well as in the game itself.
Well,
and on top of that,
go ahead. I was just thinking, this sounds like a really, I was wondering if you could write, put a list of questions together and that would automatically, determine what kind of player you are. And that would be a great way of filtering the players for the kind of gaming experience that you can have a shared gaming experience. Maybe they're all challengers or maybe they're all explorers or so you're getting the right group together. It might be, have you thought about putting a list of questions together so you can filter those kinds of players to fit within the campaign that you're trying to run?
I'm glad you asked, because if you go to DragnaCarta's Patreon, patreon.com/DragnaCarta, and sign up for the Bronze tier, you too can get the DM's Toolkit involving the Session Zero questionnaire. So, yes, I have put some thought into it.
And it puts you into one of those categories.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of questions on the questionnaire. One of my patrons has made a Google form of it, but the base document is a Google sheet. Or a Google document. And it helps you place your players into challengers, protagonists, but also a lot of other things. And it also includes a little guide saying, these players, maybe you don't want them to play with these other players. In general, challengers might feel very frustrated playing with protagonists and vice versa. And so it's something to be wary about and definitely something to look out for. And I think on top of the quadrant idea of the different kinds of players, Unlike in a video game, it's very, very, very difficult to signal to players when an encounter is too deadly for them. Believe me, I have tried. There are lots of forms of exposition. There's environmental storytelling. You can have notes, journal entries, knowledge checks, NPC warnings. But the problem is it's very difficult for players to distinguish between true positives and false positives, because the players are supposed to be heroes. And in any story involving heroes, someone says, "No, you can't fight the dragon. It's far too dangerous." And then the heroes march on, grim-faced and determined, and they slay the dragon. That's part of the story. We don't read stories about Hercules because he tried to go up against a monster that was too powerful and it killed him. That's not part of the narrative. And so players whose mind, especially on the right side of the quadrant, but it can go for all of them as well, can easily be misled by these narrative tropes and these myths that our society and culture built into this, because they wind up expecting, of course it's deadly, of course it's dangerous. And so that's one additional issue with unbalanced encounters is it's very, very difficult, no matter how much evidence you convey. The players are already expecting it. So finding a way to convey a monster is dangerous in a way that exceeds their expectations is very, very difficult. And on top of that, if you have a monster or an enemy that is morally repugnant to a player, a lot of players will feel backed into a corner where they cannot refuse to fight that monster no matter how hopeless the odds. I've actually had a few patrons in my Patreon come to me with, requesting campaign advice about this because, say the night hags at Old Bone Grinder or Strahd himself, they were obviously too dangerous, obviously deadly. They were obviously going to mess the players up. The players obviously couldn't beat them, but the players tried nonetheless. And when asked about it, they said, "We had no choice. They were evil. We had to." And this isn't every player, but there's a certain kind of player, and it's more common than you'd think, where they are unwilling to accept a bittersweet or undesirable outcome. Backing them into a corner only makes them raise their hackles further. And so, as much as you might wish this to be a lesson about, learning to pick your battles, there are lots of players who will find that repugnant, and they will refuse to go along with it, and then you'll wind up with a TPK, and then no one will be happy. So again, it's a matter of knowing your players and being very, very careful, because these moral sensibilities, these narrative expectations, these gameplay preferences, these types of players, these all come together to form this perfect storm that makes it very, very difficult to run unbalanced encounters in a satisfying way in D&D. And while it's certainly possible, and I've tried to approach that in a few different ways in the Revised Reloaded, it's something that requires a lot of care and certainly a lot of experience. And while the person who asked this question, I wouldn't doubt it if, they feel very, very well equipped to do this and convey it to their players, but it's a very advanced DMing skill, and I certainly would not attempt it all of the time. And depending on my players, I certainly wouldn't attempt it even if I was confident I could pull it off. So I would just I would advise caution here. Is what all this boils down to.
So that kind of segues into this other question, and I get to this a lot. Have you ever thought about or looked into playing Curse of Strahd in another system, whether it's an adjacent system like Pathfinder 2 or another OSR, or maybe a Powered by the Apocalypse, or there's actually some people running it now in Shadow of the Demon Lord? Have you looked at any other platforms or systems, and what's your thoughts on that?
So I haven't looked at any in depth. I've had some passing experience with, not playing Pathfinder 2, but kind of skimming a few of the rules, getting a sense of it. I had some experience with Pathfinder 1. I played a game in it for a few sessions, and I've had some experience with the Fate system just a little bit, and beyond that. Overall, I have full respect for people who enjoy those systems. Pathfinder specifically. For me, the joy of the tactics, my challenger side, it really comes out at the table, not at the character sheet. So I'm the kind of person who actually gets very frustrated reading optimized build guides and reading, what features to take, and character customization paralyzes me. Like, I've never really enjoyed games like Skyrim where, you're kind of building your character brick by brick. That's not, for me, I really enjoy mastering the fundamental game loop of tactics and strategy, hit scan and FPSs, things like that. And so I've never really been personally a fan of that sort of customization approach or that kind of rules heavy approach. And for the other kind of, more narrative heavy side of things like Fate and similar, though I haven't experienced with Powered by the Apocalypse in particular, some of them tend to swing a little bit too far in the opposite direction for my tastes, where they're kind of mechanics that formalize roleplay itself. Or the mechanics really abstract away a lot of what happens at the table, and they kind of make mini games of roleplay. And I'm sure that works for a lot of people. But for me, one of the reasons I like 5e so much is it is, as someone once put it to me, it is the Gmod of TTRPGs. It is an unobtrusive physics system that is really, really good at handling anything that you can't process in your brain and lets you process everything else yourself. Like I don't need a like in my perspective, I don't need a game to tell me, when something dramatic should happen or whether a player should be frightened of something in an out of character sense, not a mechanical sense, or whether a dramatic twist should happen. That's part of my prep. So speaking personally, I like 5e because it's exactly what I need. It adjudicates the physics of the world in a way that does not belabor itself upon the game. At least I feel. Your mileage may vary. So I'm not likely to switch to any other systems, but I respect people who do enjoy them.
Have you delved into some of the pre-released One DnD, and what are your thoughts on One DnD?
My thoughts on that, I've read through a large number of it. I have been heartened in some places. I like that in some cases, with respect to, basic character options, they're being ambitious with respect to how they're integrating backgrounds. I really liked what I saw of the rogue changes. And just in general, I like they're experimenting and trying new things to create a kind of gameplay that is more in line with how the players actually play the game. I like how they're acknowledging, for example, that some spells are really, really underplayed or underpowered and trying to fix that. And conversely, looking at things like guidance and trying to make them a little more reasonable. I will say that I'm kind of a little bit not entirely satisfied, and admittedly, this is partially because I'm a DM, not a player. So, a lot of their releases have not been targeted at me. But especially when it comes to spells, I've written at length about the so-called martial caster divide. And I've actually done the math. Like as part of CR 2.0, I mathematically kind of simulated a lot of benchmarks for different player classes, both martial and caster alike. And what I ultimately found there was, people always say that martials, they're the real damage dealers in the end game, and the casters have utility, but martials deal damage. And I found that just wasn't true. Once you're even accounting for high saving throws from monsters in the end game resistances, casters, because they have access to AoE, deal so much more damage on net, even though it doesn't feel like it because you're chipping away at lots of people instead of dealing big damage to one target. But on top of that, I found that the big issue was the issue of out of combat utility, where casters have a lot of what I like to call verbs, where they can marshals and casters both share the same verbs of how they interact with the game, let's say, where they can both attempt to persuade someone, they can both attempt to climb a tree, they can both attempt to, remember a fact, these are skills, or they can both attempt to, use a dagger to stab someone, those are weapons. But casters have access to a massive suite of additional verbs, such as they can control, they can fly, they can levitate, they can teleport, and things of that nature. And even though marshals might be better at using certain verbs, such as athletics, although it's arguable because, charisma-based casters will always be better at the social verbs than the marshals will be. But that's besides the point. Even if you account for that, casters still have this massive suite of very, very powerful out-of-combat verbs that marshals can't really hope to match. And they never will be able to without the aid of magic weapons or, the casters buffing them, which is itself, kind of a continued slight against players who enjoy playing marshals, where they still need casters to keep up. And I understand that that's very true to the underlying, traditional vision of kind of Conan the Barbarian underlying a lot of D&D's history, and I don't begrudge that, where kind of casters and magic items let you play in the big leagues, and the marshals needed to keep up. But I can't help but feel that, wizards could be a lot more ambitious, both in tuning down a lot of their sacred cows in combat. Fireball should not... I've done the math again. Fireball should not be nearly as powerful as it is, but let alone Fireball, Lightning Bolt should be less powerful. And it goes on from there. But on top of that, I think they really need to be a lot more intentional and ambitious in creating non-combat verbs for the marshals and or paring back the out-of-combat verbs for the casters, such that they could really play on a more even playing field, and that while they might have different strengths in different areas, they're still overall comparable in a way that the current system I feel is really lacking.
So I've got a list here now. I've gotten through the top of my questions, but I have a list of questions from some other people that have submitted them to me. So let's just run through them, and I have a lot. So if we can try to get through these as quick as possible.
Yeah, let's do a lightning round.
Lightning round. Okay. Well, these will be easy for you. What is your favorite location in CoS Questions and why?
Oh, favorite location. I'm gonna say Blue Water Inn. It is the site of my favorite NPCs, or when in Danica Mardukov. It is a home that the players come back to. It is a base, and it really anchors them to the world and the setting. The Blue Water Inn is itself a symbol of their emotional investment in the characters and the setting. And I think without that home base, that home to come back to and to really value and treasure, the module will be much, much poorer for it. So Blue Water Inn is my answer.
And I guess that leads into the second question: favorite NPCs.
Erwin and Danica Mardukov, their wholesome married romance is an inspiration to us all. They should be the wholesome points of light that always bring your characters home.
The next question I have here is the Van Richten's guide. Should I buy it? Is there anything in there worth including into my Curse of Strahd campaign?
So I did enjoy Van Richten's guide. I think it's most of its utility, ironically, is less insofar as running Ravenloft than understanding how to run the nuts and bolts and mechanics of a horror game and actually D&D game design in general. There's a lot of good stuff in there about reskinning, about session zero, about understanding your players' desires, and a few bits and pieces about general game design that I think are really valuable. But as far the actual domains of dread, I've heard a lot of people find them to be kind of wanting, and there's a bit of a joke about how one of the reincarnations of Tatiana in the Barovian chapter is a dragonborn shepherd, which is a little wet. But ideas are cheap, but there are some validly interesting parts of it that deal with game design that I think make for a nice little 101 for someone who would like to be introduced to some of those concepts.
Next question here. Do you recommend reading the book Strahd?
Disclaimer, confession, I've never read it. My patrons are horrified at me. They can't stand it. And I don't begrudge them that. It's a betrayal of everything my public persona stands for. I have no excuses except for the fact that from what I've heard, it gives a very good insight into Strahd's mind. And I think that if you're really looking to get into his head to roleplay it, I'm sure it can't hurt. Though be cautioned from what I've also heard, it's a little bit at odds with his characterization in Curse of Strahd, and it's very much kind of a self-told story. So he might be a bit of an unreliable narrator who embellishes and makes himself look better than he really is. But I'd say if you're interested in the Ravenloft lore and you really want to dive deep into the history of the module and the character, go for it. It's popular for a reason.
Where do you recommend introducing Ezemerelda? Do you think the Wizard Towers is the best location?
So Reloaded, the revised Reloaded, actually limits her introduction, and it actually intentionally affixes her as the party's foretold ally against Strahd, which requires her to be met at the Abbey of St. Markovia. And, I do this for a few different reasons. First, regarding the foretold ally, it's a very useful way of ensuring that the players go to the Abbey of St. Markovia, because there aren't really many other hooks. Once Ezek is gone and St. Angel's Church is reconsecrated, there's nothing really wrong with Vallaki for Irina to not want to stay there. So the players don't really have a reason to take her to the Abbey. So you need another hook into Kresik itself, and what is that hook? It's going to be get Ezemerelda at the Abbey. But on top of that, I think it's a very good place because character-wise, she makes a very good contrast, kind of the contrast with the Abbot, who's this very kind of serene but very uncanny, unsettling presence. By comparison, makes her her kind of more hot-headed but very competent, very on the level mindset, a lot more appealing to the players. She's an instant source of comfort in a very strange place. And I think if you compare her to the other locations, Castle Ravenloft, Argynvostolt, and Van Richten's Tower, there's just not really as much of an opportunity to really let her character breathe. Castle Ravenloft, you're meeting her in a space that's very alienating. Argynvostolt, she's literally not the main character of this area. And Van Richten's Tower, the players have any number of distractions. So I like the Abbey because of that. It's just this prime location for really bringing her characterization in, and because it's later in the game and the players won't get there till later in the game, you're ensuring that your players will not recruit this very powerful NPC ally until they're at a point where she will not meaningfully overshadow them. And I think that's very worthwhile to keep in mind.
Next question here is the Tarokka Reading, and this is I received quite a few questions, so I'm going to try to truncate this. The first question is, and I have some follow-ups. The first question is, do you recommend fixing the reading or having a random reading?
Well, it's probably obvious by now that I advocate fixing it, and
Yes.
I think that you'll find most folks online agree. Anytime you post on Reddit saying, should I rig the reading, almost every comment will say, please, for the love of God, rig it. You do not want your players to be fighting Strahd with Perry Wimple or Nikolai Wachter or Pilwick II, as funny as it might be. It just, there's so many options that will just cut out all the tension or that are impossible for the players to get. Just imagine them getting the Sunsword and Madame Ava's caravan. I don't need to go into further depth than that. But Reloaded goes even further, the Revised Reloaded, where it actually limits your options to 1 or 2 locations for each reading. The Tome of Strahd will always be in either Wachthouse or Volokovich Manor. The Holy Sybil will always be in the Werewolf Den. The Sunsword will always be in the Amber Temple Treasury. The ally will always be Ezemerelda, and the final location will always be the Heart of Sorrow. And I can admit that for a lot of folks, especially Ravenloft purists, this is anathema, right? Like, you still want this aspect of fate and chance to play into it, right? And I'm very sympathetic to that. But, coming back to this idea of, being very intentional about how you approach and structure your games, for me, I've tried to place these in areas where they can deliver the most bang for my buck in shaping and curating an experience that my players can really value and remember. Because, remember, Wizards included these modular readings for replayability. But chances are pretty good that you're never going to run the same campaign with the same players twice. A few DMs have done it, usually because there was a TPK early on. But in general, you don't really need that replayability. That it's kind of extraneous. And so for me, the question is not, what kind of choices should I have, but what are the best choices? Elegantly cut down to the bone. What choices justify their presence the most and synthesize the best with everything around them? And for me, that arc of the players get the tome first, it unlocks mysteries, it opens questions, it gives them a sense of place. They do that in Vallaki early on. From there, they eventually get the Holy Symbol that ties into the heist at Ravenloft. It gives them a way to defend themselves against Strahd's undead minions, but not quite powerful enough to take out Strahd himself. And in the very, very end game, in this monumental, hidden, secret, dark place in the Amber Temple, they find the light of the sun hidden and waiting for them at the very moment for the climax of the adventure. That's very powerful to me, and I think that if you approach it like this deliberate design of what these items represent and what role they play in your characters and your players' experience of the adventure, I try to approach it in a way such that I've placed them deliberately to fuel that experience.
All right. The next question here. Where do you think the final battle location should be with Strahd, or do you think it should be in various locations throughout the castle?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start by putting off, kind of the preliminary question here, which is, should the final battle be static or fixed in place? And having run both, I can heartily say fixed in place. Now, there are 2 reasons for this: gameplay and narrative. I'll start with narrative. I think it's very important to recall, in the rules as written module, Strahd is a hit-and-run phasing madman. He's going to pop in, pop out, luring your players in this merry dance all around the castle, luring them into traps, hazards, what have you. And it can be very, satisfying for the DM because it's a very tactical experience, but it can be very frustrating for the players. I've written literal essays about how it's impossible for the DM to lose unless, they intentionally make Strahd slip up. So that, from a gameplay perspective, is not the most fun thing in the world. But from a narrative perspective, think about what this represents. For the whole adventure, your players have been working up their courage to face Strahd one-on-one, to challenge him directly. They've been doing all of their best to survive his little cat and mouse game, to resist and thrive despite him, to acquire the tools and power to take him on. And then they get to the final battle, and he immediately runs away. That is going to, and has, the times that I've run it, take all of the wind out of your players' sails. They've built up Strahd as this fearsome, devilish entity in their minds, and suddenly that deflates. He is no longer the cat, he's a mouse. And even if thematically you might want to drive home some idea of, evil doesn't pay, evil is truly weak, which I don't think is, the thematic undertones of Curse of Strahd, even if that's your goal, it's very disappointing to the players because you're kind of taking away the satisfaction of defeating Strahd at the height of his power and glory, because suddenly he's fleeing from place to place and he's refusing to stand still. And so he's become Strahd. He's no longer Strahd the conqueror, he's Strahd the coward. And I think that's first off a very important thing to keep in mind. So I advocate for keeping him fixed in place. As for where you place him, even before Reloaded, the Revised Reloaded came into play, I always wanted to put him in the Heart of Sorrow. Because it is a hugely vertical, environmentally challenging area. It is the most tactical location in the entire castle for a vampire. There are walls to climb up and down. The Heart of Sorrow shakes and might make people crash down. There are wide open spaces. He's free to wall climb, spider climb to his heart's content. He can hide in the darkness, clamber around, really act on this 3-dimensional complex environment in a really satisfying way that really fits and maximizes his capabilities. As opposed to the catacombs, for example, or the chapel, where he's just kind of stuck in this enclosed space, and there's not really any sort of tactical element to it at all. And I'll add on to Reloaded, where in the revised Reloaded, the Heart of Sorrow represents the keystone of Strahd's plan to escape Barovia. He is funneling the power of the land into the Heart of Sorrow, and it is there where he must meet the players because they are parts, at this point, assuming they've reconsecrated the Fanes, they are parts of his plan, and he must lure them there and there destroy them, for only in that way can he escape the grasp of the Dark Powers, which, for those who are familiar with Old Ravenloft lore, Strahd's escape has, very often been a core motivation underlying his character in many, many editions before. And so for me, placing it there, it has gameplay significance. It's a tactical environment. It has narrative significance, and that is the place of his final plan and scheme. And it has this really deep thematic resonance where the Heart of Sorrow is symbolically Strahd's heart torn out of him. It is the symbol of his imprisonment. It hovers there by the will of Strahd, conjured by the Dark Powers. It appeared in the wake of his curse. It is itself a representation of the curse of Strahd, the heart that he tore out of his chest when he decided to become the monster he is today. And I think it's very symbolically powerful to place it there, the place where he is at his symbolically at his greatest power, in which he should fall on the players, undo him and his deeds. And I think that's very, very, very impactful.
The next question here is, do you recommend running the elevator trap or just get rid of it?
I think it's fine. The way that I like to put things is, always give players, if you want to impose a consequence, a gameplay consequence or a narrative consequence, give your players fair notice and a meaningful opportunity to avoid it. So if you add in, little hints that, alert them to its existence or that suggest something's not quite right, fine, use it if you can find a satisfying way to use it. Just be warned that due to the geometry of the castle, it's pretty trivial just to run up the stairs. Like, it'll take you around 2 rounds to get there. And so it's a nice little, bump in the road where, a few characters will start fighting with the rug and the portrait while the other players run up the stairs. But on the whole, it's not really liable to mean anything significant. So as long as you're playing it fair, I don't have an issue with it. Just, be warned that it's going to be less impactful than you think.
I think the question was and the person that sent it to me just thought it was pretty complicated or written in a very kind of complicated one way in the Curse of Strahd manual, and being an isometric map in there and everything, it can be a little confusing for some people.
Yeah, I would recommend anyone running this module, if you're running Castle Ravenloft, get yourself a good 2D map off of someone's Patreon or Reddit or wherever, Pinterest. Because I could not understand the architecture of Castle Ravenloft until I looked at it in 2D form and I saw how the rooms overlaid each other in a 2D plane. And then suddenly it clicked.
I will plug DM Andy right now because he just made his entire map pack available for free. So I'll put a link down there of all his 2D maps are available for free. So if you're looking for good 2D maps of Curse of Strahd, I'll put that in the description. Nice. Another question here, and this goes back to Strahd and the killing the Strahd. This question is, it says here, and this is, when you defeat Strahd or his hit points fall to 0, he turns into the mist and returns to his coffin. How do you handle that to get the players to go down into the crypt and to deal with Strahd when he's in his coffin after he's been hit with, he turns into the Mistform?
So I'm going to be the bearer of bad news here. I have never seen nor ever heard of this ever happening in any game. Because, unless you're, running Strahd in a way that's really exposing him, like at a low level where the players are like level 7 before they get the Sun Sword and before they have access to sunlight, in which case, it's technically possible because the rules is written he's very, very weak. His stat block is actually very, very weak, which is why I buffed it significantly and Reloaded. But in the final battle, as soon as they have access to sunlight, he's not going to die outside of sunlight. I have never seen and never heard of this ever happening. So first off, it's just not going to happen. So you might as well kick it out of the stat block anyway. He's going to die in sunlight, he's going to disintegrate, and that'll be the end. But on top of that, from a gameplay perspective, I really want you to, it helps to think about what this actually looks like in practice. Your players have this beautiful climactic battle. They've ascended the heights of Ravenloft. They've probably heisted it before. They know every inch of the castle. They've seen its traps. And they now defeat Strahd, smite into his face, and now he turns into Mistform and he flees back to his coffin. And so, maybe in some world there's a race against time if they've never been to the castle before, which most people don't do, where they have to kind of say, can we get there in time to stake him? But even so, think about what that represents. Strahd is no longer being defeated at the height of his power, but while he's lying paralyzed in a coffin. And while that might really work for this sort of, very classic traditional Dracula approach, it really fails to satisfy, in my opinion, the heroic mindset, this kind of Castlevania-esque approach, which I think a lot of players are looking for, where Strahd dies not because they stake him in his coffin, but because they overcame him by martial skill. And so I've removed that, I think, from Reloaded, or if I kept in there, I don't expect it to come up. But certainly, I don't think it is an expected or advisable way to expect the final battle to go.
The next question here is, do you recommend running the CR27, the Devil Strahd, or boosting his stat block?
With full respect, with full respect to the CR27, I have looked over it. It is quite a bit too long for my tastes. And the CR calculations, as far as I understand them, have been not done entirely correctly. And I can say this with authority as someone who has drowned himself in CR calculations in 5e combat mathematics for the past year as part of CR 2.0. And just in general, it's not. There are many reasons design-wise why very high-powered solo enemies don't work as solo bosses in 5e. In general, players are already glass cannons, and monsters tend to be as well. And the problem with having a solo monster of sufficiently high CR is that you wind up creating opportunities for death spirals, where if the players don't kill the monster in the first round, even assuming you've calibrated it correctly, with I don't know that CR27 does for a balanced encounter, even assuming you've calibrated a balanced encounter, if the monster is lucky, and because that combat at that point becomes very swingy, if the monster gets an extra hit early on and KOs a single player, the players can do less damage to the monster, which slows down their efforts to kill the monster, which makes it easier for the monster to take out the next player and the next. And you get this what's called a death spiral, where because you're putting all your eggs in one basket, you wind up with these very swingy combats where either the players kill the monster in one round or the monster just knocks the players down one by one like dominoes. And so that's a really big design risk. And so if you look at actually modern Witches of the Coast design, you see in Rime of the Frost Maiden, in their newer Critical Role one called Netherdeep, they've actually moved toward multi-phase monsters, which I actually really encourage. I've created a multi-phase Strahd in Reloaded because I do think he absolutely needs to be buffed. His rules as written stat block is pitiful. Running the numbers under CR 2.0, a single CR 15 against a party of 10th level 5s, even ignoring Ezemerelda and their ally if they get a different ally, it's going to consume like a tenth of their hit points. Right? And so you really need that unfair phasing to really make it worth their while. And even then, like I talked a little bit before how that's not a satisfying fight, and it won't end unless the DM intentionally slips up and acts in a way that Strahd would not. So you do need to buff the stat block. And so what I wound up doing with the new Reloaded is creating a 3-phase stat block. Each phase represents a different part of his history. The first one is the mage, the second one is the soldier, the third one is the vampire. And each one has different abilities and features. And the idea of it is that because the offensive power is the same in each form, it's a high power. I think each of them is CR 19 in Sunlight, and I'm including Sunlight in these calculations. You CR 21 outside of Sunlight, but you have this constant offensive damage output that is not going to shatter the players. It's not going to risk a death spiral because he's still relatively weak offensively. It's very manageable, but because you're artificially spreading it out over a longer time period, he's lasting for a lot longer. Defensively, that makes for a much more satisfying kind of gameplay where the players can slowly whittle him down while never being truly at risk of a death spiral themselves. And the multi-phases you add in there to make sure that it's never boring because, the only way to really make a solo boss work is if it goes for like 7 or 9 rounds. But if they're fighting one monster for that long, they're going to get bored. And so you add in the multiple phases to keep them engaged, where combat is dynamic, it's constantly changing, and they have to adjust their strategies as time goes on. So a very long-winded way of saying, I would not personally use the CR27, but I have buffed Strahd's stat block, and it's available for free in the Reloaded guide. You can take a look at it. I'm probably going to post that on Reddit publicly at some point, though it's already available to view. And just kind of laying a little bit about my philosophy of how I think the mathematics of these things work. Because it's not easy, and a lot of folks can really struggle with understanding the underlying math here for game design and balance. But I think once you grok it, you have an understanding of how to apply it, a lot of these concepts become a lot easier to work with.
Next question here. My players are having a really hard time finding the treasury. It seems like it's a really difficult location. Any recommendations on how the players can find the treasury or hints or clues to finding the treasury?
Yeah, so um, it's definitely very difficult to find. Like I've had my players find it, I think once or twice. Um, the the one time that my players did find the treasury, there were hostages in there, and they used locate person to find them. I think it was kind of like the end game right before the final battle. In general, yes, it's very difficult. It's very much this kind of classic AD&D like or 3.5. Like we intentionally put something in here that only 1% of groups will find, so that they feel really really good when they do. And like if you're fine with that, I think that's fine. There's a lot of very powerful stuff in that treasury, and so assuming that you haven't put a Tarokka treasure in there, they should be fine never finding it. If you have put a Tarokka treasure in there, you're going to want to do a lot more to foreshadow, to give them tools for finding it, to drop little hints telling them, hey, there's a secret door here. They can make judicious use of the Wand of Secrets from the Emperor Temple to find hidden doors. Just make sure you're dropping those hints, giving them that foreshadowing, and really conveying to them that this is there, so that it's very easy for them. They feel like they've earned it because they've gone through the rigmarole of opening all the doors and, maybe making some very obvious conclusions, but that you've laid all the breadcrumbs out so that it's really not very difficult for them. And I know that that can feel kind of unrewarding. You really want your players to have a eureka moment, but ultimately, if it's a puzzle that they need to solve, you're just going to have to give them some really obvious breadcrumbs, I'm afraid.
I got just a few more questions here. The next one is, have you used or do you recommend using any of the content from the second or third editions of Ravenloft? Now, I'm really familiar with those editions. There's a lot of content in the Forgotten Realms. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the Revised Reloaded is actually kind of a love story to the old editions of Ravenloft, the Strahd one specifically. And I say this with humility as someone who's now who didn't play those at the time, who's hasn't read I Strahd, for example, hasn't read I6. I have read Expedition to Castle Ravenloft in part, as well as a few other things. But for example, the new Reloaded, it brings in Arturi Radonovich because it's really exploring Van Richten's character arc and his redemption and a lot of the trials and struggles he's gone through to really explore how he's become the character that he is today. It brings in the Fanes, which are part of 3.5 Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, which originated for me as a way of explaining, why Strahd keeps coming back, and then eventually became, tied to this idea of how Strahd is escaping Barovia. The Revised Reloaded brings back the Grand Conjunction from Hysoska's Hexad. It's in different form. It's a different prophecy. Madame Ava gives it now, not Hysoska. But this idea of there will be a grand aligning of the planes where Strahd shall break free from the mists and that kind of thing is something that I brought through because again, this idea of like elegance, right? You don't need to go afield to find content. It's already here. Instead of going for breadth, I like to go depth. How much can I deepen what I already know with what I already have? And so for me, it's been very, very rewarding. I actually had a conversation with my patrons earlier today where we were figuring out how to bring in the Bal Verzi, the assassin's dagger that Strahd used to kill Sergei, and actually found a really, really neat way to work it in a way that doesn't feel overbearing, that actually fills a need that I had in another adventure arc that I was looking for something to fill anyway. And so I've had a lot of fun playing with those tools in the Reloaded sandbox, and hopefully folks who have enjoyed prior editions who read Reloaded feel that I've done them justice.
Next question here is, do you recommend using the interactive Tomb of Strahd?
So I actually know the guy who wrote it, Assiduous. He's a great guy. I personally have not used it. From what I've seen, he's done a fantastic job on it. In terms of lore, Reloaded clashes quite a bit with it. There are a lot of divergences, and I don't know that you could easily transplant it into my guide or anyone else's necessarily. It's kind of its own thing. And just speaking personally, from a game design standpoint, I'm not so much a fan of, kind of cutscenes. And to be clear, Assiduous puts a lot of work in there, very lovingly to make sure give opportunities for real gameplay and choice. But ultimately, it is kind of this, living out of Strahd's backstory in a way that doesn't really allow for, many divergences. And from a narrative perspective, for me, I like Strahd best when he feels like this character of legend, where you're learning about his history, but in a way that still leaves a lot to the imagination. And speaking personally, the idea of getting to see his history firsthand through these visions makes him far too much of a man for my taste. Brings him down too much to earth, especially at the early stages of the game where you're likely to get the tome. And so I personally have not used it. If you want to use it, more power to you. But I guess that's my thoughts on that. I prefer the players to learn about Strahd, through rumor and hearsay and legend rather than, kind of seeing it firsthand for themselves. I'd rather build up the legend than show the man behind the curtain.
All right. And that leads me down to some more personal questions with you in Curse of Strahd. How many times have you run Curse of Strahd?
I have run it 3 times so far. My original one with a few friends. The second one was what I like to call my Reloaded campaign. It was the first one where I was actively developing and prototyping Reloaded at the same time, the original Reloaded. The third one was Curse of Strahd Twice Bitten, that rules as written campaign with those other Curse of Strahd DMs that we live streamed. And I'd love to run Reloaded, as I've been calling it, the new version for some folks at some point, but I haven't really had an opportunity yet. But at some point, I'd love to return to the Mists for a fourth time.
And did you play those games in person? I mean, I know one you played online, but did you play the other games in person or ever play in person?
All three were online. All three were online. Yeah. Okay. I've traditionally been an online DM. I've been running in person for a homebrew game for the past few months, on and off. Though we've now gone online for assorted reasons. But I've generally been an online DM, though I've run in person in the past. It just so happens that between COVID and between just playing with folks in different cities or different states or even different countries, you wind up needing to play over Discord or Roll20 or Foundry or whatever it might be.
I hear you loudly and clearly because I live in a remote, well, it's not too remote, but in central Portugal in a historical village, and no one here plays Dungeons and Dragons or any role-playing games. So my only option is online. What online platform do you recommend? Or do you
I've
use?
I've been using Foundry through Forge VTT. It's been really good. Disclaimer, Foundry gave us a free license for Twice Bitten. Forge gave me a lifetime subscription, and we promoted them on it. So I'm not unbiased here. But as products, they're just very exceptionally solid. I've never been unhappy with Foundry. It can be a little buggy at times, and it takes a bit of work, but the end product I've been really, really satisfied with. And my biggest concern with Foundry, the reliability of hosting a server and all the annoying technical things that go along with it on your own local machine, Forge solves for me. So I've been very happy with them, and I'll be moving my my homebrew campaign to Forge. Our first game on Foundry is actually tomorrow evening, so wish me luck.
Good luck with that. And I have, well, I don't know if this is available or not. I have somebody asking here, are you a pro DM or would you be willing to DM for people? And if so, how could someone sign up for you to be their DM?
So first off, I'm flattered by the question, so thank you very much. I always welcome inflating my ego, so thank you very much. I have pondered pro DMing. I think the challenge is I just don't really have the time to really market myself, and in terms of compensation, economically you've got to make a decision. Like I get a lot of joy out of writing Reloaded, out of running the Patreon, and so far, and I've been looking to pivot to YouTube, and so the prices that I would have to charge for that to really be economical, I don't know that most groups would be willing to pay them. I'm not an expert on the market for it, but from some cursory discussions, I think that most folks probably wouldn't be interested in that unless they were willing to stomach the budget for it, just because again you got to know how to use your time most economically. Although in principle I wouldn't mind it. In general, actually I've also been recently thinking about the possibility of maybe it'd be cool to run Reloaded. For kind of get back into streaming, get back to podcasting, like for Twice Bitten, but this time show what Reloaded looks like instead of the rules as written campaign. And I'd love to do that in principle. Love to show off the module to kind of show off what it can do, the guide itself, I mean. But having been basically kind of a director / pseudo producer, though I didn't do nearly all of the work. Everyone pitched in for Twice Bitten. I don't know that I could do that a second time. And I'd really love to just kind of show up, run the game, then leave, and someone else handles all the fiddly technical stuff. But all that to say, I'm sure there's a world where I would do those things, pro DMing, sharing the game, whatnot. But I'd have to have I'd have to see the right opportunity, and as of right now, I haven't seen anything.
And a final question here is, what other campaigns? These are obviously, I think they're implying pre-written like Curse of Strahd. What other D&D campaigns or adventures do you recommend, or will you be participating to create something from like Reloaded?
So so I guess two questions here: recommendations and what I would look at in the future. So stuff that I recommend. I am a big fan of Wild Beyond the Witchlight. I think it is the most solid adventure that Wizards of the Coast has put out to date. It is robust, it is resilient, it is flavorful, it is evocative, it is well balanced, it is well designed. In some lifetime, I'd love to run it, though I don't know that I ever will. It is very easily runnable out of the box, and it really does a really good job of the fundamentals of good game and narrative design. So I wholeheartedly endorse Wild Beyond the Witchlight. Insofar as things that I like to do in the future, after Twice Bitten, there was kind of a running joke that we do. There's kind of a hope that we might do a Frostbitten, a rendition of Rime of the Frost Maiden that was really more tailored and homebrewed and kind of homecrafted the way that I'd done for Reloaded. That didn't wind up happening just for time reasons. The cast couldn't make it work. If I were to do another Reloaded, it would probably be Rime because I love this kind of cosmic horror, Arctic horror vibe, but I felt really disappointed when the module came out and it was a lot more traditional fantasy oriented. And so I'd probably, I've had this idea in the back of my head for the past, 3 years of how I'd rework Rime to make this kind of Eldritch Lovecraftian Arctic horror experience, from start to finish, kind of pulling out its guts and rearranging them to really fit that vision, kind of, The Thing, things like that. I'm a big fan of the SCP Foundation, so I'd love to bring in some sort of, those kinds of creepy paranormal elements as well.
That sounds cool.
But thank you. I just haven't had a chance to do it. Maybe someday. You never know. Never say never. But I guess, if I were to do a second Reloaded, it would probably be for Rime.
Yeah, I like that adventure as well, but I definitely think it could get a good polishing and adding some stuff to it. I actually played in a campaign of that. Hey, and just out of a personal question here, this follows up the ones that were just asked you at the end. How long or how many sessions are your campaigns, your Curse of Strahd campaigns?
So, by my memory, I think my Curse of Strahd campaigns tend to be between 50 and 70 sessions. Maybe 40 to 60-ish. 40 to 60, I think. That tends to be about what it comes to. And keep in mind that the way that I approach Curse of Strahd is I try to structure things so that the players visit every or nearly every location over the course of the adventure. The Fanes themselves add in maybe 1 to 3 additional sessions, but in terms of orders of magnitude, the way that I tend to run the games, hitting pretty much every location in Barovia, it's between 40 and 60 sessions. Which admittedly in my case, because, we often have hiatuses, we have the final boss of scheduling, that might stretch over, 2 years or more in some cases. But 40 to 60 with a happy median of around 50, 55, I think is about my experience for Curse of Strahd.
Yeah, mine was my one that I ran in 2020, 2021 was 65 sessions, 18 months, but we had a weekly game. And I know Harrison, who's the mod over on
Yes.
Yes.
I've heard his horror stories for sure. I'm very impressed by his players.
I think it was 152 sessions, 3 years.
Yes, his players, they're very impressive. I'll say that much. And full mad respect to Harrison for running that kind of game.
Yeah, I was really impressed. And I just interviewed the dungeon coach who is currently running it, Curse of Strahd. And he is actually videotaping his session prep as well. So it's nice getting different perspectives from content writers as well as DMs and map makers. I really, really appreciate the time that you've spent answering all these questions and providing very thorough and detailed answers. I hope the people listening took notes because I was actually here with my pen taking quite a bit of notes. In full disclosure, I am a Patreon member of DragnaCarta. a lot of that stuff that he talked about, the CR2, I highly recommend checking that out. It's a really, really cool tool that you can ratchet up and down. And I think you did a great job of explaining that. And Reloaded's it's not done yet, right? You're still coming up with some versions of the new Reloaded, right? I think your last one just went out a day or two ago, right?
Yeah, so the way that I've been structuring Reload is instead of chapters as per usual, I've been approaching it in the form of arcs. I find that structuring campaigns in the form of narrative arcs is a lot more easier for DMs to grok rather than kind of assembling narratives, because the way our sessions are unfold are in narratives, right? And so I just released arc C, Into the Valley, which covers everything from the border of the village of Barovia up to the first morning in Vallaki. Reloaded itself, the re-reloaded is publicly available. I've been posting it on Reddit. The free post on Patreon is available. Everyone can download the latest version. The Patreon itself, I've been publishing my rough drafts there. So where the public version of Reloaded is up to the first morning in Vallaki, the Patreon rough drafts, which are available to bronze tier and above, they actually I've almost finished Vallaki at this point. Arabelle, St. Angel's Church, Fiona, Ezek. I'm currently working on a plotline involving Stella and Victor. The Tome of Strahd is done. And that really lets me kind of keep ahead because I get a lot of nice feedback from the patrons. I kind of get this very holistic top-down view of things by staying ahead. And the patrons get access to rough drafts. I've got outlines and notes for everything going through the remainder of the module. I've outlined everything going through the finale and the epilogues. And at this point, it's a matter of kind of filling it out. So there's a lot of fun discourse, a lot of good stuff. I've actually been making it a habit to work on Reloaded and posting drafts in the Discord twice a day. I work every morning, 7:15 to 8:15, and then 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. And every time I finish an hour's work, I post it up on the Discord. I put a notification out to the Reloaded ping and say, let me know what you folks think. And it's been a really great time getting to hear what everyone thinks and get feedback and have a discussion going as I work to shape these rough drafts into a final product for publication.
Well, I recommend it. It was hugely influential on me when I got back into CoS Strahd. Thank you so much. You're going to find links, by the way, in the description down below to his Patreon page, CoS Strahd Reloaded. I also put some other links in there of stuff that we've talked about. Definitely check out CR2. Again, DragnaCarta, thanks so much for taking time. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor, so thank you again.
Thanks again. Until next time, this is PyramKing signing off. May all your rolls be critically successful.